of global crisis, global risk, and global consequences, organized by the Geneva Center for Security Policy, GCSP. The GCSP is an international nonprofit foundation physically based in Geneva, Switzerland, comprised of 52 states in our foundation council, of which all the member of the Security Council. The GCSP mission is to promote peace and international security, prepare and transform individuals and organizations so that they create a safer world. We are impartial, independent, and inclusive. The center achieved its objective through different tracks: executive education, research, public discussion, as well as innovative fellowships program for executive in transition. Our community has grown substantially over the last few years, and our alumni community reached now more than 8,200 people in around 165 countries. When we started this webinar series 6 weeks ago, the infection was approaching 1 million infections, and there were almost 48,000 people who have passed away due to the coronavirus crisis. This week, today, we are approaching 3.7 million infections worldwide, and more than 257,000 people have passed away in the world. This is 5 what we had 6 weeks ago. The majority of the people who have passed away are located in the United States, with more than 71,000 dead. The topic of today is of high importance because it pertains to the ability to think ahead, to think about the future. And for that, we have a very distinguished panel that have a set of very different skills. We'll have first my colleague, Emily Monroe. She's Deputy Head of Emerging Security Challenges at the GCSP, and she will talk about why strategic foresight is of value today and demonstrate this with a few examples. Then we have the pleasure to welcome Brigadier General Renald Droe. He is the Chief of Staff Joint Operation Command of the Swiss. He's basically responsible for the planning and command of all the operation of the Swiss Armed Forces. Over the last 6 weeks, he has been very public figures because he was in charge of the engagement of the Swiss Armed Forces to fight this virus. He will talk balancing the time, right and long term. Then we'll have Dr. Who is Director of the Infinite Future and also past fellows at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. And she will talk about anticipation in times of extraordinary turbulences. Then we have Professor Thomas Gauthier. He's professor at EM Lyon Business School. He will talk about the fact of linking foresight to strategy and action. Then we'll have Dr. Riccardo de Borges Castro. He's a former advisor on strategic foresight at the European Political Strategy Center, the European Commission's in-house think tank. He will talk about strategic foresight in the EU. And lastly, we'll have Dr. Matt Burrow. He's Director of Foresight Strategy and Risk Initiative at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. And he will talk about the future of the crisis and how this may impact the international environment. As I mentioned earlier, the United States is a country that has been hit the hardest in terms of people who have passed away because of coronavirus. And it has been reported that the government in the US got caught by surprise. Then there were some reports reporting that there has an intelligence report that will warn the government up as early as November last year. Actually, if you look at US national security documents, that it dates back much further. For instance, every 4 years, the National Intelligence Council, the US intelligence community's senior analytical body, produces a document called Global Trends, a forecast of the forces likely to shape the decades ahead. In 2008, the Directorate of National Intelligence published this document where it highlighted that the emergence of a novel, highly transmissible and virulent human respiratory illness for which there are adequate countermeasure could initiate a global pandemic. And the report was giving the time horizon of 2025. Then, if we look at other documents that are produced on an annual basis, for instance, the annual threat assessment of the intelligence community, in 2009, the director of US Intelligence, National Intelligence, Dennis Blair, was already mentioning that one of the most pressing transnational challenges for the United States is a pandemic. He restated that a year later in 2009, and where he said even more bluntly that of equal concern, the lack of consistency survey and diagnosis capability for disease in animals, middle gap even in developed countries, that undermines the United States' ability to identify, contain, and warn about local outbreak when it spread. In 2013, its successor, again, was even more blunt, that such an outbreak would result in a pandemic that causes suffering and death in every corner of the world, probably in fewer, excuse me, I have a problem with in fewer than 6 months, not a hypothetical threat. And in 2019, his successor, Daniel Coates, was again, we're asserting is remain vulnerable to such an outbreak. So the information was there, and this information is part of what it is all about. So the topic of today is really about what's next in terms of foresight from a conceptual perspective, but also from a more practical perspective, what could are the possible development in the future. And maybe we'll talk also about why, even though governments have the information, they not rely on this source of information. So to start talking about these very important issues, my colleagues Emily Monroe will start to brief us about what foresight is all about. Emily?
Thank you so much, Jean-Marc. And I am going to just share my screen, and I would like to set the scene, if you like, for this session by talking about the present, the future, and the past. And so why that order? I think we're caught in the present, so I'd like to speak to those dynamics first. The future, because the title of this session, as Jean-Marc just mentioned, is what is next. So we're all wondering and preoccupied by where this is going. And I'm going to end with the past, because there's a risk that we go back to the same ways of doing things. And there's an opportunity, of course, that we don't do that. I did take a very loose inspiration for the structure of this presentation in the short amount of time I have from Sohail and Ayatullah's Futures Triangle. So I'm going to speak first to the push of the present. So we're caught up in today's dynamics, understandably. We want to return to our day-to-day lives. And there's an uncertainty and unknown also for the broader implications. It's an evolving and adapting situation, but I'm just going to highlight from the present context, so from the near term, what are some of those international security implications to start us off? And then I'll move on to the future. So first, from a governance side, very fundamentally, this is a health crisis. So it's affecting government services either directly with their own health, and we've seen a number of leaders affected, or more indirectly. So the functioning or reduced functioning maybe of civil services. Related to this is parliaments, for instance, that maybe are not meeting, or debates are postponed, elections, and that could lead to some public frustration. I really want to underline this is very limited this far, but of course it's important to address the scenarios if that's not the case. Secondly, the contacts between countries. This is so important on sensitive issues in international security for this relationship building, for the in-person meetings. And so many meetings we see are postponed and rescheduled. And there's a concern if there's this back and forth between a prolonged quarantine period and then an easing of those measures, this could impede a return to normal functioning for some time. So that's something also to watch out for. There's an increase in existing tensions. So there might be new tensions created, but it's more likely that we're exacerbating existing ones. And Matt Burrows is going to speak more to that later on. So I'm going to just leave it there, but just underline that This is particularly acute in fragile contexts. So in those countries experiencing conflict now, or in those post-conflict instances. So that's already we see some action happening, but it's important to watch that over the coming weeks and months. It's always regrettable that sometimes a crisis can be a catalyst to escape maybe a deadly situation. And we've seen here already the UN Secretary General call for a global ceasefire. So that's also wanted to mention that opportunity in that sense. The next on the fourth on the list is disinformation. Of course, technology is playing an important role used for a lot of good in this crisis. But there's also this potential for the misuse. So it could be used, disinformation by this pandemic, they use for malicious actors for gain. So they might wish to exaggerate the impact or bring attention to some inadequate response efforts or assign blame. So that's something as well to look out for. And of course, going forward regarding the tracking of this virus on an individual level and individual privacy and surveillance concerns. There's other issues being neglected that need attention and action. So the focus on COVID and this immediate response can't be faulted, no doubt. But the other issues continue. I think when we see the virus arriving in places like Yemen right now, and also we see that maybe the high level attention and momentum on other global issues such as climate change, we need to make sure that those continue. So I think this recent call for this green recovery, we'll see if that catches on, but it's important to keep an eye on that. On a practical side, still on this, we still haven't worked fully out how virtual meetings can take place when voting is required, and it might be a slower decision making at that level. I think overall, and just to end on this slide, as we progress in this crisis, it's really interesting to watch out for how this situation is changing our society's ways of operating, but then a step further, how this may impact the international security sphere. So might we see new ways of seeing and reacting to existing situations, or innovative forms of exchanging, and that could be potentially exciting. Second, on the future. So the pull of the future, and what is the contribution of strategic foresight? So not the future in the sense of the crisis preparedness, but really a step further on how we can do better at anticipation, which is really also the topic of this session. So in UN speak, they're talking about building back better. So how can we harness this moment to help countries become stronger in the future? And how can strategic foresight contribute to that? First, the interlinked time horizon. And I think Brigadier General is going to speak to this. I'll be quite brief here. But it's often important to distinguish between different timeframes and to give the space, for instance, to think about the future. But you can't always put each of those into their separate categories. So there's a need to also think about how they intermingle. Second, surprise and shock. There's been a huge human toll, which Jean-Marc mentioned, and the global breadth of the COVID-19 has all kind of startled us. This might be an opening to look at the possibility of other developments, and that could be beyond global health, a future surprise and shock in different areas, very different areas. Thirdly here, the structured approach. So COVID-19 reminds us about uncertainty in our lives, and many questions that we ask about how this pandemic might evolve. And the future is fundamentally uncertain. So the Foresight approach is uniquely placed to help us manage that uncertainty. And of course, there's different processes and methods that can be used to help us with that uncertainty. And lastly, and I think this is really from an international security perspective, the blurred boundaries. We all know that threats don't respect geographical boundaries, and they don't respect disciplinary boundaries as well. In global health, of course, COVID's an example of this. But here we can also find some support in Foresight to help us broaden our perspectives on with various means that we have available in this discipline. So understand also how those factors may interact as well. So next on the past, and I'm ending with the past, not the crisis barriers, and there's a number of barriers in the crisis that we can obviously speak to, and there's many of those, but barriers in terms of strategic foresight. And this is my concluding point and slide. And I want to refer to this question that I've put up there, and that's just a reflection question for the audience, to say that thinking about the future is not a luxury, and it's often sort of put in that category on the practical side. whereby thinking about the future is relegated to that strategic planning cycle with a very fixed and limited time frame. We want to move the future out of that category. I want to just point to two shifts that can maybe help this, and then I'll end on this point. So the first shift is about the policymakers. So it's a shift from overemphasis on this day-to-day management to more anticipatory and adaptable planning. And that means obviously very hard implications in terms of priority setting and resource allocations. And I don't want to paint over that this is a new problem. This is a long-standing problem. And I just want to quote Thomas Schelling here, where he said in the early 60s, there is a tendency in our planning to confuse the unfamiliar with the improbable. So we need to spend more time on thinking about these unfamiliar threats. That could be the big ones, the catastrophic risks, the existential risks, or it could just be a fresh look at some of the other issues that appeared alongside pandemics in recent reports. Secondly, and lastly, at the same time, strategic foresight processes need to do even better into exploring creatively alternative futures and the space to do that, but then making that connection to policy action that can be taken today, and that can be small or large. And we're going to hear more about that here. So I'm going to end here, and I look forward to the discussion, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily, for setting the scenes for how to think about foresight. And what you mentioned is very, in order to think about the future, we also have to take into consideration the present. In political science and sociology, we call that path dependency, and this is also very important to build upon the current action, so as to develop some policy in the future. And you reminded us about two shifts that need to be made. One of the most important one is that policymakers shall sometimes exert themselves day-to-day operation and try to see the bigger picture. So now we'll shift to Brigadier General Ronald Rowe, who has been in the midst of the storm, and we look forward to your views on foresight. Brigadiers?
Thank you very much, distinguished guest speakers. Can you just show my slides?
Yes.
Because, thank you. So you can then direct them. I will just say you when you can change the different slides. Thank you. I am, first of all, very honored to being invited today as guest speaker in this GCSP COVID-19 webinar session. Thank you very much. As a Chief of Staff of the Swiss Armed Forces Joint Operation Command, I am actually mostly focused on the operational, tactical, and sometimes also technical execution of the Swiss Armed Forces operation. Therefore, my insights will probably have a rather down-to-earth approach. Nevertheless, while trying to manage the actual crisis, I can easily experience and assess how good our strategic foresight has been in the past and provide you my very first assessment of challenges that we are facing now and in the future. Next slide, please. For if you are not familiar with some specific characteristics of Switzerland, you see here some relevant background information about Switzerland and its armed forces. Important to understand the context of my speech. First of all, Switzerland is a federal state with 26 cantons based on the classic division of responsibilities. And while external security come under the purview of the federal state, the cantons are responsible for domestic security. In this sphere, the federal level will only offer subsidiary support if the resources of the cantons are insufficient or not available, and they appeal to the federal administration for support. Our Swiss armed forces is based on the militia system. It means we stick to the principle of general conscription. Compulsory military service applies to all male Swiss citizens and the women serving voluntarily. And annually, that means approximately 20,000 persons are trained in basic training for a hour of 18 weeks. Next slide, please. Here you see some of the main results of the permanent strategic foresight process: context and threat analysis, capability-based armed forces development to anticipate the dynamic change of the operational environment. Crises are hard to predict in advance. Therefore, we increased our readiness system with the reintroduction in 2018 of a mobilization system for all the armed forces. This new grounded readiness system enables us, even in unexpected events, to immediately call up and rapidly deploy fully equipped troops. The regionalization, the mission command, and adapted C2, this facilitates a civil-military cooperation, rapid engagement, and situational awareness, also flexible, rapid, and operation-tailored support of civilian authorities by the territorial division. And the third, emerging threats are unpredictable, and it's important to all instruments of the Swiss security system work together. And for this reason, we implemented series of national security exercises with all federal and cantonal partners. The last one was last year's with terror. Next slide, please. Which are the contribution of the Swiss armed forces in the COVID-19 crisis? On the 16th of March, 3 p.m., the Federal Council declares the exceptional emergency within Switzerland in terms of the Epidemics Act. This allows the Federal Council to take the responsibility in the domestic security and enabling the introduction of uniform measures which are normally in the responsibility of the cantons. For example, closing school, closing restaurant, closing shop, etc. In order to respond to the subsidiary request from the cantons, the Federal Council ordered the Swiss armed forces to be ready with maximal 8,000 members of the armed forces until the end of June. On the 16th of March, 5 p.m., we started the largest military mobilization in Switzerland since the Second World War, mobilizing by text message 4 hospital battalions and 5 medical companies. 15 hours later, first Swiss citizen in uniform started the 3-day special training session before the first mission. In the last 50 days, approximately 3,800 militia forces supported the health care system with medical services, in particular with nursing care, patient monitoring, medical transport, or hospital logistics. And around 1,000 people, military personnel supported by the cantonal police forces by helping protect embassy and the border guards at national border and airports. Next one. After these 2 months, my first personal insights are the following. I think the principle of subsidiarity and the management of resources of federal level worked very well. This is surely the result of the last national security exercise and the fact that people managing the crisis know each other. Yes, Switzerland is a small country. In the last months, we faced some tricky moments, coping with the supply chains and the just-in-time culture. The dependencies we have implemented in the last decades give us some challenging situation due to the failure of some business struggling with restriction in the mobility and shortness of supply. We face also the risk of becoming a virus distribution organization, and we have implemented very hard rules, for example, limitation of movement, interdiction, or 3 days outside the barracks. Our system is definitively not built for living with the corona protection measures. This impacts us dramatically in the way of living and training and show us the limitation of 20 years improvement in what is called as efficiencies. For example, having more personnel in smaller room is surely effective, but is not the best idea with the pandemic threat. And the last one is the duration of service, 2 months, versus the pressure from the employers and the universities, and the dual role of our personnel as military personnel and as citizens. The next one. The context analysis and the risk management is permanently ongoing on military strategic and operational level. We are constantly planning according to different possible evolution, futures, scenarios. We consider we will not go back to normality, but we will go back to a new normality because COVID-19 will certainly have lasting impacts in geopolitics, human behaviors, industry, technology, way of life, holidays, and also on military organization. In the short terms is for us weeks, we will continue or terminate missions, and we are going to maintain readiness with our militia system. We will prevent virus proliferation among service members. We prepare us for possible next COVID waves, and we are ensuring the continuation of recruiting and instruction for basic and repetition training despite social distancing regulation. In the middle term, I speak for months, we are balancing retrospective responsibility and mission creep discussions and analyzing impact on actual defense spending plans, with a big challenge coming with the referendum on the air defense and new combat aircraft. Regain readiness in the world performance profile, get used with this new normality and compensation of identified shortfalls. And on the long terms, years, possible development of federal security policy instrument, reduction of dependencies of external providers to maintain supply chain, long-term armed forces development with the risk of narrowed focus, and we assume that the impact of the COVID-19 on the national economy will indirectly affect the defense spending plans, as growth projections are cut and huge chunks of government finances are absorbed trying to contain and alleviate the economic contagion. Implement or better accelerate the digitalization and technical innovation, ensuring an adapted degree of security in military affairs and operation. Next one. This is my last slide, and I am then ready to speak with you, answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brigadier General. You highlighted that in a way, foresight is in the DNA of the armed forces through two things. First, through training, because training is a way of preparing the future, and you show how the Swiss Armed Forces through training managed to overcome some of the unknowns and obstacles that you highlighted, supply chains, dependency, as well as the risk of contamination. And then the second part was about foresight in for the future. It's short-term, trying to first guard against a second wave. Middle term, it's about regaining readiness, and the long term is about planning with the lessons learned of what you just went through. So a enlightening example of foresight. The next speaker is Professor Thomas Gauthier. Thomas, the floor, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Marc, and good day, everyone. So now with this presentation, what I will try and do is take a bit of a step back on the situation we are all experiencing, and possibly develop a few notions that can help us make sense of this situation. So the title of this webinar today is what is next? I'd like for us to start with a slightly different question, which is what has been up until now? And what has been up until now is, by and large, and I'm going to sound a bit caricatural here, for all of us to try and shape the future. We've tried as much as possible to shape that future by acting in the present and trying to make sure that what we desire for the future is in fact happening. This is a century-old project for mankind, and in a way we are pretty much all the daughters and the sons of French philosopher René Descartes, which thought was about for all of us to become like masters and owners of nature. Now, most likely what we are experiencing now is showing us that this is a bit of a hard bet for us. To try and control that future, what has been working quite well up until now and might still work well in the future is innovation. Innovation is really the engine for our economies that help us shape that future so that it fits with the desires we have. We we hope, and sometimes we succeed to bend in a way the reality so that it fits exactly what we want for it to be. Now, it has happened also that in some circumstances we have been prone to believing in some sort of technology solutionism, which really is that we might think that each and every problem will find a solution in the form of an ever more complex technology-based one, which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. Now on with the COVID-19 situation we are all experiencing globally, and I think Jean-Marc very nicely showed us that this is a global situation. What we are being taught in a way is that this official narrative of the future with which we have been working is possibly gone. The official future, which was about amplification and acceleration of the present, might never unfold. So some are even going as far as saying that COVID-19 may be the actual entry point for mankind into the 21st century. It might look like, it might be sensed as a first global warning that is directed at the whole humanity. And it might even be that this warning is in fact triggered by collective actions if research ends up showing that the pandemic has connections with other human-driven activities and possibly connections also with man-shaped disasters like biodiversity erosion, climate change, etc. Now, to start the discussion about connecting anticipation with action, well, I think it is worth saying that up until now, collective action, for instance, at the level of a state or at the level of a company, has been by and large informed by forecasting. And forecasting here, to use a very simple definition, is about using the past and the present to anticipate the future that we will most probably find ourselves in. Now, as Pierre Vac, who was a very famous scenario planner with the Shell company would say, forecasts are dangerous because they are working most of the time, but they don't work exactly when we need them, when we are facing situations of disruptions like the one we are experiencing at the moment. And then what that tells us is that the time might has come for us to start learning how to use the futures in an effort to clarify the present. And clarify the present here means uncovering threats and opportunities that were up until now left unattended, that we did not notice or that we did not want to pay attention to. The other reason for starting to try and use the futures, and I'll clarify this sentence in a moment, is for all of us to overcome as quickly as possible the disorientation state that we are finding ourselves in. Disorientation here meaning that we find it extremely difficult to both sense and make sense of what is going on around us. To use the futures, what is really about exploring alternative futures, basically telling ourselves stories about how the future might look like and start rehearsing what we would want to do in each and every one of those futures. Ultimately, to use the futures is not about questioning what the future will be, but the conditions in which it will emerge. To use the future is beginning to question and to throw the hypothesis out there that we might be experiencing changes in the conditions of change, as Real Miller from UNESCO would say, which really is about recognizing that we might be experiencing a fundamental change in the organizing principles of the world we live in. Some go as far as saying that we might have entered some sort of post-normal times, which was nicely depicted some time ago by two researchers, Funtovitz and Ravitz, who would say that such post-normal times would have to be with a situation where facts become uncertain, values are in dispute, stakes are high, and decisions are urgent. And I guess we are all recognizing ourselves in this saying. So linking finally anticipation with action, what can we do? Well, again, if we look at what theory indicates, there might be three basic stances, strategic stances that we could take in the face of the situation we are living. And I'm going to quote here some of the work by one of my mentors, Professor Rafael Ramirez from the University of Oxford. Strategic stance number one here is about preparation, is about stocking up resources, like for instance, stocking up energy or creating ways to be more independent when it comes to getting a supply of energy for the economy to run perfectly. Strategic stance number two has to do with relocating, if not escaping. What that is to learn and to figure out how to migrate to spaces that are less prone to turbulence. For instance, in the area of supply chain, that might have to do with relocating production, going away from extremely widespread supply chains so that the effect of turbulence are not as dearly experienced. And finally, strategic stance number three would be about reinventing collaborations, creating coalitions of actors whereby as they work together, they somehow create spaces that in themselves become less prone to turbulence. And what we might see is more and more coalitions that bring together players that would not in the past work together. One example that in fact is in place now for a couple of years at least is the Technology Foresight program within the Swiss Federal Office for Defense Procurement. The program is called DefTech, and it's been now bringing together in an unorthodox manner actors such as, of course, the armed forces, but also technology experts, science fiction writers, graphic designers to probe together the futures that we might all find ourselves in. So again, as a conclusion, this area of turbulence that we are experiencing is likely to grow. It is likely to become a driver in the organizing principles that will shape the world we will be in the next month, in the next years, in the next decades. There are answers, there are strategic stances that we can take, and it is probably worth starting to dig and experiment with those strategic stances as quickly as possible. Thank you for listening in.
Thank you, Thomas, for highlighting, in a way, what you mentioned, which is you using foresight to actually highlight the present by thinking about the future. We mentioned methodology where you have to migrate to spaces that consequence of the analysis, but also very important, reinvent collaboration through development of coalitions of actors that would not traditionally cooperate. So a very good takeaway for the future. The next speaker, Ricardo.
Thank you very much. Sorry that I was at a glitch there with the sound. Thank you. I mean, also for inviting me. It's a pleasure for me to participate. I mean, I think I agree with several things that were already said. And Jean-Marc, if I would start, from where you start quoting all these studies, I believe that, that the time, and I wanted to make a few reflections first on foresight and action, some lessons that I think we have learned so far in the EU, but I mean, it's generally, and then a little bit about the future and how sort of foresight or what we might need to do to be able to deal with these type of situations if they are sort of also to occur, in the future. I think, generally on foresight and action, what I would say is that the current crisis is not a failure of foresight. I think it's a failure of preparedness, of preparation, to use a term that Thomas just used. And I think this is, in a sense, you mentioned several studies. There are several other studies that relate this idea that a pandemic was foreseen. Of course, we didn't know when this would happen, But I think the issue here is more an issue of preparedness. And I think probably in the case that we are looking at like COVID-19, I think not only then preparedness, but also I think initially a failure of transparency in terms of how data was communicated and available for us to understand what was happening. And then I think, as the crisis progresses, then there's the issue of competence. Either you are able to deal with it, or either countries are better or are less prepared and competent to deal with it. But I think, preparedness is in a sense would be the ultimate result of a foresight process. And I think this in the webinar description, you really speak about this link between foresight process and policymaking. And I think, in foresight, maybe there are three types of people. I think there's the producers of foresight, people that make the studies, do these things. Then you have the consumers of foresight. But I think there's another element here that we cannot forget, which are the translators. We need to be able to have people, in public sector, private sector, you name it, that are able to distill insights from, from the wonderful reports that Matt, for example, used to do, that Wendy does, many others, and try to translate these into concrete policy recommendations, strategies, plans. So this, in a sense, to build preparedness, build resilience. So I think there's a missing link here, and I think no one in the world was able actually to get this right. So I think there's a lot of there's a lot of work to do. So this, in a sense, for me, foresight is always a call for action, because if it doesn't lead to preparation, then okay, it's intellectually it's very rewarding, it's very interesting, but it's not very useful, so to say. Just to put it very very bluntly. I think in terms of lessons, I think so far for the EU and looking at how the EU has seen this, I think, the initial instinct of member states to take care of themselves has been gradually abandoned. But this, national reaction, I think it's very natural at the beginning, but it highlights that, if it's not facing a pandemic, that the EU is able to unite, then what is? And so I think this also raises issues in terms of how we think about the organization of the institutions. And here, when I mean EU, I'm mostly speaking actually in this case about the member states, because I think most European Union institutions were out there from the start trying to coordinate. And I think now the level of coordination has increased, tremendously. And I don't know if yesterday you followed this pledging conference that the Commission sort of organized with so many others to raise, almost, about $8 billion dollars for vaccines, for treatment. So there is, I think, the reverse of this lack of collaboration in the beginning has been, a speed up in terms of collaboration and cooperation. And again, going back to some of what Thomas mentioned in terms of collaborations, I think the example that the scientific and medical community are giving around the world in terms of the way that they're collaborating to find a vaccine, to find a treatment to this disease, I think it's outstanding. So I think in that sense, there is a lot of, and there are more lessons to take, as which were mentioned in terms of supply chains. Do we need to rethink, how this is, how global trade is organized, and how we, about how much digital, how much health tech and health, products will become also part of a geopolitical, game. So I think we need to consider some of these aspects. But as we still, facing the crisis, I think it's still very early to be able to take some, some clear lessons from this. But at least, the needs of unity, at least, from a European point of view, and a need for more coordination in terms of, these type of issues, I think it's fundamental. Once we start looking at the future, which, relates immediately with this point that I was saying, for most, I'm no longer a EU official. But I know that me and my colleagues in the past, we're always frustrated when we are asked, so the EU doesn't do anything, and we have to say, okay, we don't have any competences in this issue. So I think a discussion that EU leaders might need to have in going forward is whether health should become either at least a shared, competency between member states and the EU, because at the moment, it's an exclusive responsibility of member states. Of course, the EU is there to coordinate, to advise, to share, best practices. But in a sense, the Commission does not have the power in health as it has in competition policy or in trade. So it's a different type of thing, and it's maybe a discussion we need to have, a very difficult one, because this might need a rethink, or you need to touch in EU treaties, which is always a very difficult conversation and difficult process. But we need to think about this, because I don't see that there is a way to move from the problem that we have now if we don't have that conversation as well. On the more practical side, also, I think strategic foresight a few years back, everywhere, and I think most people that are around the table would agree with this, even mentioning the word foresight, people would look at you, say, okay, what, you have the crystal ball, so you're going to see the future? No. I think now it's much more concrete, and I think several crises also led the EU to be much better and to scale up its operation in terms of strategic foresight, to the point that now, since this new commission, there is a vice president for foresight. So strategic foresight was even elevated to the political level. And I think now what needs to happen at this level is that I think in my proposal, and I've made this proposal since 2016, is a reorganization on how this system works within the EU, because all the potential is there, all the capabilities are there, but I think there might need to be an institutional design issue either within the Commission or with already existing structures that bring together all EU institutions, such as the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System, which is a collaboration of EU institutions on strategic foresight and global trends, which Matt Burrows also contributed a lot to the start of this project. So, there are capabilities there already that need to be used or can be used to actually continue to upgrade, the strategic futures and planning at EU level, so that we can do some of the things that, that Thomas was speaking, that also, Brigadier Droz was also mentioning in terms of how we deal with this. To finalize, I think, there is in all of this, in going forward, and that's an issue which I didn't think that we have discussed yet. I think this crisis and this pandemic creates a different problem. It's a new thing for all of us, but I think the issue, it has to do, the previous crisis in Europe, the financial economic crisis, of course, had terrible consequences from the economic and social point of view. But this one is about life and death. And so I think if it was very easy to ask people, those that can actually stay at home, to go home, I think it's going to, I don't yet understand how people will leave, their houses. I don't know how much the element of fear, which is, the reverse side, the element of trust, so I think this trust, commodity in society will be key for us to be able to get out of this crisis. And I think this will only happen with honest leadership. I think this is an issue of leadership, of competence, on trying to address, this crisis, but also of speaking, openly and honestly with citizens. Because otherwise, I think I haven't seen any studies. I was curious to see if any of you have seen studies recently on trust, since the pandemic started, because I think, it's almost inevitable that people will be fearful now, and there's been a failure in some systems. So I would be interesting to understand how people will feel comfortable going back to whatever normal it is. And I think if we don't do it with everybody together, I think this will be very hard. I'm hopeful that if we don't have a false start now with the confinement and the reopening, I think this is possible. And I think then let's use this moment to take the right lessons and to upgrade our systems to make sure that they are much better sort of adapted to this. And then finally, let's focus on the translators. Let's focus on the people that can actually are able to tell leaders and decision makers. These are some of the things that you need to do in light of these futures or these things that we might be faced in the future. It's not easy, but it's doable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo, for highlighting that this crisis you mentioned is not a failure of foresight, but preparedness and transparency. And in the end, it's about a failure of the application of what has been developed as foresight into, and you mentioned, you looked at the EU, and you mentioned that the new commission is taking foresight much more seriously. But I think the point that you made that is very important is about trust. And we had this discussion also when we looked at the webinar on technology. It's fundamental to keep trust among society, to keep the social contract. That is created by having an open debate with it. And our viewers that you can raise questions. You have already done this, so don't forget that you can use the Q&A tab and feel free to ask your question. And we'll have a round of questions at the end. Next speaker, Wendy.
Thank you. I'll share my own screen. So I'll take that responsibility from you. Let me get this cranked up. It's wonderful to be near the end because the speakers My fellow panelists have been raising excellent points, and I'm looking forward actually to addressing some of them. And it is every year my delight and honor to work with the GCSP offering a module in their Foresight week on methods. So essentially, I spend an awful lot of my time teaching people how to do foresight and all of the different tools there are to both engage in foresight, strategic foresight in the sense you're talking about it, and what I think of more broadly as future studies, futures research. And I find myself and my colleagues in Futures and Foresight find ourselves in a very unusual, almost surreal moment in applying methods. Because in some ways, the future or the futures have run so hard into the present that they have shattered the present. And in so doing, the present itself is constantly reconfiguring all of those futures. So my metaphor is everything's up in the air, like it's been tossed up in the air. That's kind of what it feels like to be actively engaged in using futures tools and futures thinking and foresight to help people think through this. So what I'm going to do today is give you two examples of different projects that can do that I'm working on right now, and how they're facing some of these challenges of this unique time that we're experiencing. But I want to start off with sort of one point about COVID-19 itself that in many ways is kind of the heart of our perception of it. We, as human beings, we make sense by telling stories, and that theme has come up a lot. Some of the previous speakers have mentioned it. So we try and tell stories about that encompass some of our uncertainties, that encompass possibilities for the future. When we do that in future studies, we call them scenarios. The difficulty, and so those stories are frequently analogies from experiences we've had in the past. The problem is we do a disservice to the actual issue if we try to understand COVID-19 itself as a disease via analogies. And you have seen that problem in the various messages that have come out of the leadership of the United States over the past 3 months, and the media brouhaha in the US, where people have been saying, well, it's a coronavirus, so it's like a cold. Well, no, it's like the flu. It's like a seasonal flu. Okay, well, maybe it's kind of like the flu of 1918. They keep trying to make analogies. And one of the things that we are finding is that every single day brings us more information about this. So one of the first things I would tell you is don't frame this issue too quickly. To some extent, the more we understand it, the more we see how it is unique and different, the more we will understand it. Another issue that relates to this is the tendency for people to look at the statistics and look at the graphs, because they're scary. Scarier in some places than in others. And what the graphs tend to focus on is who's infected, how many people die, and what do those numbers look like per capita in a country. The problem is that, and this is something we can learn from history, the problem is that epidemics like this, pandemics like this, the question is not just how many people die, it's what is life like for the survivors. And this particular disease is unlike a cold or seasonal flu in that initial understanding of it suggests that for the survivors, recovery may take a very long time. Some people may always have 15 to 20% a decrease in lung capacity. This may have a huge impact on the actual surviving workforce, right? So what's the recovery profile for this is a question you might want to think about asking. And what does that mean, not just for worker productivity and for the economy, but also for the extent to which people will be engaging in society in all the ways they used to, whether that's volunteering, engaging in hobbies, taking their kids for walks, no matter what it is going to have literally a big physical impact that we don't yet understand. Don't frame that too fast by past experience, because this is a novel coronavirus. One of the points I'd like to make, you hear people in future studies and foresight and futures literacy a lot using, and strategic foresight, using the mnemonic VUCA for kind of the complex and chaotic systems in which we are embedded. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous situations. Jamé Cassio at the Institute for the Future has recently written a great blog post where he says, maybe we need to update that or add a corollary, because it feels like we're more in Banny times than VUCA times. And what he means by that is brittle. Systems are proving to be brittle. Everyone is more anxious. Change is non-linear, and potential impacts are incomprehensible. So your new mnemonic for, your new acronym for the day, from VUCA to Banny. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about, sort of what futurists do and what we do in future studies and foresight by using the examples of 2 projects and 2 quotes. The projects are very different in style and in intent. The first one I'm going to talk about is what you might consider the classic public policy strategic foresight project. And in fact, it is for the European Commission. And what I want to talk about is what happens when you are engaged in a project that is trying to assess a changing context, in this case for research and innovation, globally, while in a situation where, as I said, change has slammed into us and in many ways rendered the present completely chaotic. Now, I will say one other thing about these 2 projects. They're both ongoing. So essentially, I'm sharing the teaser trailers in movie terms with you. And you can sort of watch this space for the reports that will be coming out of both of these. So the first one, and the first quote, today in, I think it was in The Guardian, Dennis Miller and Yanis Varoufakis were being interviewed or wrote a joint essay on the current global situation. And Varoufakis had this great quote that to me summed up essentially this moment we're in. We are sitting on a saddle point, prepared to tip in either direction, and it is utterly indeterminate which of the 2 directions we will go in. I'm having a hard time seeing my own slide because there are so many little bits and pieces that Zoom has put up here. So utterly indeterminate which of the 2 directions we will travel. And I noticed that the first question, Maya Kirkovsky, thank you for asking that question, is post-COVID-19 period intro into the era of no globalism, or on the other hand, on the contrary, beginning of a big society built on mutual aid and dependency. This next slide is for you, Maya. So we are working on a set of scenarios for the EC on research and innovation. And the project, our part of the project, I'm working with my colleagues in SAMI Consulting, is for global and regional scenarios. And so we did the global scenarios first to be the kind of framework, and then worked through the 10 regions of the world. So this is 44 scenarios. We actually did the workshop project in November. Went through a rewrite and revision period just to get the styles right and usable for a lot of policy situations. And we were doing that, yes, you guessed it, in late February, early March. And it got to the point, my hand on my heart, where literally every day for the past 2 months, month and a half, we've been getting up and having to revise our scenarios every single day because of breaking news. Now, sometimes the breaking news just reinforced one of the outcomes. So the great thing is we have tons of live sort of weak signals bursting into strong signals that potentially support any 4 of these scenarios. And exactly that point about, are we going to go towards an exclusionary, nationalist, protectionist, isolationist framework in international relations and in how countries connect to each other? Or are we going to all work together as one planet, as humanity as a whole? And as Varoufakis says, we are literally at the tipping point. Don't know. So in one sense, this is the best of all possible times to be doing foresight. Because when you say to people, everything is uncertain, potentially everything could change, people actually agree with you for once. So that's the upside from a futures perspective. And one of the points of writing scenarios like this is that you try to identify two uncertainties that encompass enough that they do capture key questions, that they identify those saddle points that could potentially tip in either direction. So this is the lesson here is that sometimes even futurists are overtaken by change and by the extent of chaos that change can produce. And so one thing I would say to any of you out there who are listening, anyone who has done strategic work, if you have in the last year written any scenarios, you need to go back and rewrite them, because every single day, the present is changing our futures, our potential futures in interesting ways. Now, the other quote I want to share to talk about the second project is from Ken Stanley Robinson, who is a famous science fiction author and recently found himself on a long planned camping trip that went from, like, I don't know, the first week of May to the second week of May. Went in, there were some, news reports about a virus, came back and the world was shut down. So his quote, "The virus is rewriting our imaginations. What felt impossible has become thinkable." And Emily, that it seems goes back to the quote you shared about the implausible or the incredible. I can't remember the exact quote. Now we realize can be possible. So we're getting in a different sense of our place in history. We know we're entering a new world, a new era. We seem to be learning our way into a new structure of feeling. Okay, so that's the second project, and I will wrap up because I know we have limited time. The second project addresses a diametrically different way of engaging with the future, of using futures, of learning futures. The first project is typical. You had a number of researchers, you had a lot of participants, you had a formal structure for creating images of the future for a strategic purpose, for purposes of creativity and critique as well. The second project takes an entirely different tack and says, no matter what analysts come up with as images of the future, which may be helpful, people already have images of the future. All of my colleagues here on the panel, all 140 plus of you, you are already thinking, well, in 5 years, this could be really different, or, in 5 years, will most universities have collapsed? Will we still have airlines? What will you have images of the future in your head? So another way we can approach the issue of asking what might the future be is to ask all of you to share stories, to share what you now think is thinkable that previously you might have thought impossible. And I would argue that in a time of extreme turbulence, where clear path dependencies are harder to spot, that just as we only understand that what seems to be the randomness that we call chaos actually has a structure, is if we have enough outcome points. In a time of this much turbulence, we will best understand what some futures might be by collecting a myriad of outcome points, a myriad of stories about the future from everybody out there who's experiencing this present and is using their imaginations to explore the future. So, second project, working with Cognitive Edge using their crowdsourcing platform SenseMaker, we are collecting stories from everybody who cares to submit a story or multiple stories, alternative stories about how you think the future could play out post-COVID using their online platform, SenseMaker, and that is the URL if you want to contribute a story. So that's two different approaches to dealing with what is a difficult time, even for futurists. What many of my colleagues, we talk about how surreal it feels that everything that we talk about in terms of open possibilities and chaos and turbulence for the future, we're living it. So my concluding remarks, the turbulence of the present is rewriting all of our future second by second. The possibility spaces of outcomes from the chaos of that turbulence are shaped by sensitive dependence on initial conditions. And depending upon your topic, the initial conditions are now, are now, are now. They're every single second is an initial condition. Two last things that came up while people were talking. Post-normal times, a lot of my, the reason I'm drawing in chaos, turbulence, complex adaptive responses to turbulence is because I work with a group called the Center for Post-Normal Policy and Future Studies. Tomas mentioned post-normal science. Led by Zia Sardar, the center is actually working on exploring what post-normal futures would look like. And I highly recommend to you there will be 3 blog posts, but 2 are currently up from my colleagues there, and you've got the URLs. The Post-Normal Perfect Storm in 3 parts that explores COVID-19 and the pandemic from that. And the other thing that we have to remember, as we are all thinking, well, you know, in 5 years, please God, they'll have a vaccine or they'll have treatment, we'll be past this. Yes, in 5 years, we'll be past this. And then, of course, we will face the actual crisis. So that's mine. And I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Wendy, for highlighting that the danger of framing things too quickly, because basically you put some labels on it and then it's difficult to think outside the box. And then you presented your 2 projects, and the second one has to do with trying to be very much collaborative by trying to gather as much stories as possible from much people as possible, so creating some kind of collective intelligence. The next speaker, but not the least one, Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. And I wanted to talk about how I see potential futures and put the accent here on the plural. I'm going to share my screen here and bring up slide. So I've been thinking about you know, what's next, and obviously there's so many uncertainties that you can't actually forecast what would be next, is I think a point that everybody has made. But I've been outlining for policymaker audience here in Washington what could be on the horizon, hoping that they choose number 3. So we're going to look at what I consider 2 bad scenarios before we get to the third. But first one is the great accelerator downward. And this is basically a lot of the trends that we saw before the crisis are aggravated. And the big trend here was, you know, a lot of state-on-state competition leading to conflict, more protectionism. So potential for globalization, and that was happening before the crisis hit. And the crisis, because it first in this scenario is lingers, you know, we don't get a vaccine very early, so you always have those fears, and you have potentially more waves of the pandemic. And you also have a very difficult recovery. So everybody is hoping, obviously, for the V-shaped recovery, and it takes much longer. And this is a bad recovery for all the major economic drivers in the world, US, Europe, and China. So everybody, in a sense, is suffering on the economic side as well as with the health crisis. And there is some minimal cooperation at the beginning, but then basically everybody of the 3 part waves. part ways. And in this particularly, and you're already beginning to see this in Washington, US, we have in this scenario, there's a bigger write-up of all these scenarios. We have a Trump administration that gets reelected and basically remains wedded to the tariffs against China, bringing back as much manufacturing back to the US, very protectionist regime, and erecting, in the sense too, against disinformation, erecting a firewall against Chinese and Russian communications. So you see here really almost a reenactment of the 1920s and 1930s. And it's only a matter of time before you actually get to a hot war. So in the second one, and China does come out first. This is obviously the big fear at the moment in Washington. And it is not just because they seem to be the first on the recovery, but also is that they spot an opportunity. The US and Europe are so self-absorbed that they're not paying attention as to what is happening in the developing world. China obviously has a vested interest in terms of its Belt and Road policy, so they go and start investing more. It's also a way for them to begin to create an external market, so long as US and Europe, as I said, are very still trying to dig themselves out of the crisis. Obviously, and we've seen this, the Chinese Communist Party has taken a huge hit with the pandemic, but they can deflect some of that criticism at home by pointing out just how badly the democratic world has dealt with this, and where that doesn't work, obviously they use suppression. In the US, you have and Europe, because you have a very slow recovery, again, you have these protectionist urges. You have racism in the US really come, Asian Americans are attacked, which has already happened. And you see really populism beginning to flourish just as the way it did after 2008. But in this scenario, it's they adopt Bernie Sanders' ideas, and you really have a movement. Of course, you have huge debt, so how do you bring that down? Is you need to really tax, and there's a real, with populism, it's much more leftward leaning. They want to have a wealth tax. They want to go after the wealthy in this, and because China seems to be heading out there first and really taking advantage almost of the situation, you actually have the US and Europe coming together in NATO, and NATO begins to look at China as the new enemy. In the third scenario, you have the same thing happening in the sense that you have a still lingering economic recovery, and you also have a long period in which you still have the threat of the virus, even though it's been more controlled. But in this one, you have really the revival of what we saw after 2008 of G7, G20 cooperation. Now, I think, realistically, that this is only going to happen if you have a change of administration in Washington. Even though at the moment, Biden, who looks to be the Democratic challenger, is talking internationally, but he's also very talking very nationalistically about China. But in any event, in this scenario, we have basically G20 coming back into taking the position it did after 2008 and really coordinating a recovery. And in this sense, also working on the coordinated lifting of border closures. And I think we haven't talked as much about that, but I think the fact now we all have these strong borders in place are going to be a problem if we're going to get back towards open societies and that even in Europe, a single market. You have a real emphasis on really conquering disease in this scenario, and that's where you have the idea of setting up an agency which will make sure that this will never, such a crisis and tragedy will not be happen ever again. And this warning agency actually has some teeth. They can sanction countries who don't take action on these big global challenges, and that includes over time climate change. Now there's obviously a huge debate. EU is in favor because it looks like another step on the road to a more multilateralist world. China and US are really the holdouts, but China wants an open economy, and the price to be paid for the US and EU dropping the protectionist threat is basically to join this agency and to clean up their, as I call it, the disease cesspools. We've known about these for some time. I was the author of actually the 2008 global trends. We had that scenario. The health community in the US knew that was a huge threat. So this is really forcing China in return for which they can have the open economy. And in the US, you have that same old debate about giving up sovereignty, but in the end, you have a majority because of just how serious a crisis this has turned into that they go along with actually multilateralists and going back more to a multilateralist path. Reception, we unveiled these about 2 to 3 weeks ago. The reception has been pretty good, except for the fact that there are a lot of people in Washington who do not like scenario 2. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt, for highlighting 3 scenarios. One has to do with more fragmentation of the international order. Second, which has more to do with bipolarization, US and Europeans versus China. And the last one, more multilateral scenarios spearheaded by the G20. We'll now turn to the questions, but before we do that, there have been some questions about the URLs that were showed during these presentations. They will be put on a website if the speakers agree on that. Now, for the questions, I let my colleague Ashley. Ashley?
Thanks, Jean-Marc. And thank you to everyone who have been asking questions. We will try to get through as many as we can, and I will try to direct the right question to the right person. My first question will be to Ms. Emily Monroe. A question from Tiana. Are there examples out there where foresight has been used outside of the Western world in Europe? Does it translate well across cultures that may view the future differently? Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Tiana, for the question. I'm conscious of time, so I will answer fairly briefly, but I think in short, yes, many examples, a rich experience is out there, but underline that no one size fits all. And that's, I think, very important in this domain. So, I mean, Singapore is always at the top of the list of examples when you think of a foresight practice, and many interesting examples there. But I would just say that different countries have very different approaches to this, whether it's more executive driven or there's more of a parliamentary input, or how they involve citizens in that type of conversation, whether it's more expertise driven or technical. So I think there's a great diversity out there and different examples of how this can be done, but definitely not a recipe that can be taken from one country to another, or also from one organization or regional organization or other organizations as well that are also have different ways of adopting this and thinking about this within their own planning structures. And I know some of the other panelists might want to come in there as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. My next question is to Brigadier General Droz. What is the Swiss Armed Forces learning for future crises? Thank you.
A lot. We are directly working with after action review, and I am going in about 10 days to make the first part of this after action review. My teams said to me today that we have more than 100 different points in the learning, but I assume that they are not only on the strategic level, and a lot of these, they are tactical or operational level. I mean, what I learn alone here as in my function is the fact that it's quite difficult to plan something what unforeseeable is, because we haven't the possibility to compare, to take a situation and to speak about the situation and to say it's the same, and then we go in the same modes. It was something new, and it was for us quite interesting, but difficult, fast every day, every week, to go in the new future and to try to cope with this new situation with the middle we have. And the armed forces is traditional, is a modern one, but traditional. And all the means we have and all the personnel we have is traditional. And then we cope between the traditional way of make military and the special needs in this pandemic, also with infrastructure, with living, with the risk on the young population. That was all news also for us, and we are going to learn a lot.
Thank you very much. My next question is to Thomas. Will you please answer the question on that a lot of us may be thinking, actually. We all saw that the pandemic may be something that could happen in the future as a crisis. What could help policymakers and leaders take it more seriously to apply the Foresight findings? I'll leave it at that for now.
This is a very difficult question. What can we do more seriously after such Foresight work is done? We can probably try and push Foresight exercises as far as possible to make us feel the futures, experiment the futures. If I had more time, I could develop on the links that are being made between Foresight and design fiction, which really is about designing fictional futures that you throw participants in so that they feel for themselves what the world might look like. So I would say probably to create a sensorial track in Foresight and make us feel those futures as opposed to read those futures.
Thank you very much. So the next question on to Ricardo from Degaratu. He's asking, the lack of preparedness in the pandemic crisis proved that the preparedness is no longer the final stage of strategic foresight. Preparedness is about politics, political priorities, and political agenda. Do we need to redefine strategic foresight?
Thank you for the question. I mean, I think no. I think you're right. I think he's right in what he says or she says. I mean, I couldn't get exactly the name, but it's about. I mean, it's a preparedness is about setting priorities, and it's about political choices. And I think, I mean, preparedness. It's easy. I mean, it's easier for me to say that this is a failure of preparedness, but indeed, I mean, when you are a political leader, and this is how I try to see it, having worked with a couple of them, and how they then perceive problems, is that they're they're limited resources, and there are it's when you're governing or when you are running the European Commission. There are several issues that you need to deal with, and I think probably what preparedness normally implies or would imply is sometimes, for example, in this case, is redundancy. You need to have things in place to be able, when something like this happens, that you can act on it. But this might mean that until it happens, you have redundancy. You are spending money on things or resources or energy on things that you might think, okay, this is probably unnecessary for this moment. But it's something that needs to be there in place for once a crisis happens, you need to actually use those things. So of course, for a political, so this, in the end, I still think that preparedness is one of the stages of strategic foresight. I think it's important that we are able to translate insights from foresight, all up in the air, or all the expressions that we are, post-normal times. How do we translate this for a politician or for a decision maker? What does that mean for them? How can we break this concept down that it's practical so that they understand even in their language? Because in the end, like you say, it's about choices. It's about the decision-making process that you have. And it's for the decision maker to be able to do this. But I think it will be also very easy for me to say, oh no, everybody was warned, foresighters told that this was going to happen. And then, this is about them. No, I think we also have a role here to be able to communicate the findings and the things that we do, and alert decision makers for some of the things that might be very, very serious and that might mean something for them still, because again, there's this issue of, shorter or, political cycles. But at least, in Europe, we're democracies. This is a structural element that we need to count. Politicians are elected democratically, so we need to count on this. This is also sometimes their timeline. This is their outlook that they have. But I think, in the end, preparedness is a very difficult, element to build. But I think in hindsight, if we think about all the, just today, the spring economic outlook for the EU, it's basically a drop of 7.5% for 2020. This is, there is, the costs that we have. I think sometimes maybe when we think about this, if we had done more work in terms of preparedness, maybe we didn't have the 100% system in place, but better than we had. Maybe this would have been as costly as it will certainly be. But it's in the end, it's always about sort of priorities, politics, decision making in the end.
Thank you, Ricardo. I'm going to lump the last question together for Wendy and Matthew for the sake of time, if that's okay. A common question that has come up during this time is, are we entering an era of codependency or further isolation of nations? In the post-COVID world, will we end globalization or build a society on mutual aid and dependency? Thank you.
And actually, I already answered that with my slide that indicated that actually was one of the two key uncertainties that we identified for the project that we were working on. So do I know which way we're sliding yet? No, I agree with Varoufakis. We are actually on the saddle. It could go either way. So it is a classic situation of chaos. And part of what that means, and to get back to stories, so it means the stories and narratives that are emerging are even more powerful, because it only takes a couple of really strong narratives by some leader somewhere to tip the situation from one direction to the next. Matthew?
Thank you, Wendy. Over to you, Matthew, if you wish to add a few comments. Thank you.
I think the present course is on that scenario one, which I talked about, which would be the going in the direction of deglobalization, more barriers, more protectionism, a world that at least I would not feel comfortable with. I would hope for the cooperation, but I don't see the leadership, and you actually need leadership from somewhere to get, I think, that leap to cooperation. And I don't see it at the moment, but like Wendy, things can change, and the hope would be that you would see leadership at some point.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I know that for the viewer, it's a bit frustrating because we cannot address all the question, but I would like to use my position as the moderator just to follow up on the question that was addressed to Ricardo for Brigadier Dro, because he is between those people who are thinking, doing foresight, and the practitioner. And I would just wanted to know if he felt that and what were the constraints for which the policymakers had to go through in order to take foresight seriously, the different scenarios. Brigadier, you still there?
Yes.
All right.
It's quite difficult. I mean, Switzerland have, in the end of the day, I heard also from the session in the last hours a positive feedback from that what we have done. It's okay. The complexity in our country is the systems. When you go back in 2013, we have done a pandemic exercise. And when you go on the document on 2013, we will see a lot of possible changes we didn't make in the last years because the complexity of the systems, because the different learning we have done in 2013 was addressed on different level, on different authorities. And the sums of all these different possible changes, they have not coming in the last years. And I hope very that we are going in the new reality in the next months, in the next years, where we are going to address precisely with responsibility and the different level, what are the different goals in which time, and then we have a better chances to be ready in the next years. To finish.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, I think what you just mentioned is very important. Even though we could agree all on common scenarios, there is no one model size fits all for each country, because each country has a different organization and also a different strategic culture. And this needs to be taken into account when we actually want to devise some policies based on strategic foresight. I would like to conclude this webinar and thank you all the speakers for the excellent insights and presentation. Next week, we will have episode 7 of this webinar series. It will be on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on environment and climate change discussion. What could be derived from what we've just seen, and what might be also the implications in terms of resources maybe that could be devoted to fighting environmental problem. It will be on the 14th of May at 2 p.m. CET. As usual, you'll find all the information on our website, and you'll be able also to watch this webinar as well as the previous one episodes on our different social media channel. Up until next week, stay safe, and don't forget to check out our websites and social media channels. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. Bye-bye.